Welcome to our presentation called Cultivating Awareness, Expanding Our Understanding of Inclusion in Graduate Early Childhood and Childhood Teacher Preparation. We are all from Nazareth College, and today we have Carrie Dunn, Cindy McPhail, John O'Gorman, Cobby Roland Storm, and I'm Susan Sturm, and we'll be talking about this process that we engaged in. So to start, I am the program director for 8 different graduate programs at Nazareth in inclusive early childhood and childhood education. So we have a range of programs under that umbrella that are initial certification programs for folks who have no teaching background, additional cert programs for folks who are coming and want to add on that special education certification or maybe a gen ed cert at a new level. And then we have our professional cert programs for folks who are here seeking a master's degree because they're already certified. All of our programs are inclusive at Nazareth, and that just means that special education is not an option for us. Everyone gets a degree in a base certification as well as the special education certification. So inclusion is really part of who we are at Nazareth. This is part of our School of Education mission. It is really foundational to the work that we do. So we feel comfortable in inclusion. But this year and in the last couple of years, we've really taken on this diversity, equity, and inclusion work in a much more specific and intentional way. And this is not just happening in our School of Education, but like many college campuses, it's happening at the broader college level. So there's been lots of opportunities for us to engage in this work, both in-house in School of Ed and broader at Nazareth. And my colleague is going to talk a little bit about this process for us of learning.
So for us, I think one part that was interesting is that it really began with us, and we had to do deep introspection, realizing that everyone is on the road, but we all have long to go. And if we don't start with ourselves, not much will happen from there. So what do? We read books. And that's certainly what we were able to share together. So we formalized the books that you can see here, such as Revealing the Invisible, which if you're not familiar with that text, it really looks at a teacher education perspective where teacher educators and students in that program had to look at bias, our own, their own. And so that gave us a good text to have rich discussion with. We moved on to Cultivating Genius, which many of us will talk about today as a seminal text for our programs, as well as White Fragility. And with these, we were always looking for what else can we change? We knew change had to happen, but how can that happen? And who can we learn from in doing so? And through this, we were able to develop a true awareness of our own personal bias. We all say everybody has bias, but this was a time to do a lot of hard thinking about ourselves and shared that we were having these kinds of discussions with our students, really wanting to understand it first from a human perspective, and then as educators, we knew that we needed to make curricular and programmatic changes that would deeply address diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we really weren't ready yet. We had to spend some time, several years in fact, really in the material. And so we were able to engage in wonderful professional development. And the highlight for many of us in that was the phenomenal work of Goldie Muhammad and Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz. And we were able to spend a day with them, really sinking into Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius, as well as a lot of Yolanda's work. And it was able to put a great spin on where we were at the time. And an interesting part about that is while many of us, faculty and staff, engaged in that professional development, so do many of our students. And as you'll hear as we go through, they all speak about it to this day. So we like to know that there was something that was really powerful for many in those conversations. So this took time. And what I appreciate is that we took the time. And to be clear, we are just at the very start of this road, right? We are just have our toes on the track there, and we have far to go. But we have engaged in this through really a process of doing a whole lot of introspection, as well as reflecting on what we might want going forward. So it was really a back and forth process, a lot of inner conversations. I feel like I talked to myself a whole lot about this, as well as taking time to have those conversations with colleagues. Oftentimes we say that's something that we want to do, but at this point we did make the commitment to that, and that's made a difference.
So at the program level, kind of along with all of that professional development and that deep work that Carrie just described, I was running some professional development. And this past summer, I had 2 professional development opportunities, one with full-time faculty where I brought everyone who teaches full-time, invited them together, and we thought about what we really wanted as our goals related to DEI work. And we sort of structured out a framework of where we thought we wanted to go. We came up with some new materials to share out with the program. And then I ran a second one where I invited all faculty, including full and part-time faculty, to come and engage in this conversation. We took a look at Gholdy Muhammad's text. If you have not read it, I highly recommend. We highly recommend. We discussed it. We broke it down. We thought deeply about our own courses that we teach, and then the program level changes. So these 2 professional developments worked together to help get us to where we are today. So we did some resource sharing. Every class had a slide in a slide deck that was shared, and we talked through what everyone was doing in the name of transparency and working towards shared goals in DEI. We developed a new lesson plan template, and it looks pretty much like a regular lesson plan template that you might see. It's got the objective, the standards, the EdTPA stuff, but we also made sure that we included important elements like how are you addressing the language function of your students. And then we also developed a new unit plan template, and I'm going to see if I can hop out and show that for just a second. So got to move, my controls are in the way. So our unit plan template, I'm not going to show the whole thing, but I'll show briefly. It's a neat, we developed a neat organized template. It's got some block plans, and you can see what we're most excited about here is that we added an element here for our candidates to think about their historically responsive pedagogy. And that aligns directly with what Gholdy Muhammad was asking us to do with our teacher candidates in her text. So they're identifying the identities, skills, intellect, criticality, and very important to us was that they also think about the joy that they're using in their teaching, that they're inviting in their teaching. And we are asking them to think about layered texts. And then our lesson plan template is pretty typical, but you can see we did add a box here for the language supports that they're using. So this sat alongside some very purposeful and intentional anti-bias and anti-racism elements in our courses and in our syllabi. And I'll let my colleagues talk about that in a second. Our target here was really to sort of pilot the work, our initial CERT programs, where we can catch most of our students. A lot of our students in additional or professional CERT programs have a baseline knowledge of this, but we really wanted to catch those initial CERT folks. So this is rolling out this year with them. All of them in our programs this year are reading this as a core text that they'll carry through the rest of their programs. And this work will continue, it's ongoing, and it will, in the next year or 2, we'll look at those additional CERT and professional programs, although you'll hear a lot of this work is already happening in those courses and those programs. So now you'll hear a little bit about some of the actual changes that have happened this year.
Hi, as somebody who began his career as a school-based teacher educator for Nazareth College, who has now transitioned into a college-based teacher educator for Nazareth, I have been forced to really, as Carrie mentioned, do that introspection. And it really has been a challenge for me. And the joy I'm finding is is seeing how it is affecting our students at Nazareth College. So one of the things that Susan challenged us as professors was to make some changes in our courses. So some things that I've done in my courses is to incorporate the language of Muhammad's 4-layered HRL framework into our course discussion. I really thought that was going to be a challenge, but based on where the students are, it really has transitioned well because the students are hearing it in many courses. So that challenge hasn't been there for me as a professor. I'm utilizing the School of Education's revised lesson plan templates and the unit plan templates. Susan has given us that autonomy to be able to make it work in our programs and in our courses, and I am finding that to be very helpful for the students. I've changed a content project where I'm allowing my students to either choose a social studies topic or a social justice topic, and so we talk about the difference between those. In the content project, as well as in our lesson plans, I'm asking the students to connect, label, and explain the aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the language they're using. So to make sure that language is consistent with their work. This semester, I've modified my syllabi to include a literature circle on This Book is Anti-Racist. And I'm just looking forward to continuing my own personal growth, as well as to continue to modify and work with Cubby and Cindy and Susan and Carrie and the whole department to continue to adjust our course content to embrace the DEI aspects.
And I teach a sister course of the course that John is describing right now. And while the course I'll talk about for these next few moments is in the professional level, I was privileged to be able to work with all of my colleagues on this, and I just wanted to get started. So I will just say the power of collaboration, that's something we all know about. And so often in our very busy college lives, we say we want to do that, but we don't have time. And I very much appreciate that this group committed the time to do it. And I think that's what's really made all the difference. So for this course, which is also a social studies and ELA course, but for students who already have education as their undergraduate program, they engage in an exploration project. And the purpose here is to take an area within the content of the course that they don't know enough about, where their passion to explore more. And what's happened over the last 2 years, and some of my students just decided their topics this week, things have come up like teaching peace in the time of turmoil. I had a student email me last night and said, what I really want to do is, all right, now I have the diversity books. My classroom library is much more diverse than it ever was. What now? What are those next steps? As well as teaching the real history and the untold history of voices in New York State in particular. So I'm excited that right away, these students have seen this as something that's important. And the reason that they have is that they've taken other courses that have built up to this level. So those are things that I cannot wait to see how the students take that. Just as John has a content project, I have something similar, and making the point where students have to identify what are the aspects of DEI in your whole content project, and really explain the whys and the how. So it's not a check-off list, it's the explanation of why is this intentional is really the purpose. And this group knows very well that one of my favorite parts of Mohammed's work is the incorporation of joy into lesson planning and unit planning. And when I read her book and saw the balance between criticality and joy, I felt like I found home. And so sharing that with my students and getting that, having them feel that same excitement, again, having this now be a seminal text, our students can interact with it pretty regularly and easily. But of course, we want to not just have one, we have many reads. And so as you can see here, these are some of the lit circles and professional book groups that we've done with students. Let's talk about race. One in particular I wanted to point out is Bettina Love's book about We Want to Do More Than Survive, and about abolitionist teaching and educational freedom. And what's really interesting for us, because we are a Rochester-based college, is that Bettina Love was born and raised in Rochester. So there are a lot of interesting connections that just make this work that sometimes can feel theoretical to our students and to us, and sometimes not, not the face that we see in the mirror, really ground in, we know the streets, we know the organizations. And as always, not just reading the book to enjoy something as a human, but then what will we be doing as educators with this? So those are some of the things. And one of, as Susan had pointed out, the work that we did over the summer is that piece where we identify it in the syllabus, in the syllabi, that this is something, and not that checklist idea, but how are students engaging this? And most importantly, how can they speak to it and speak to their own journeys as we continue to speak to our own journeys?
Carrie.
One of the nice things about teaching the Capstone course is that this provides the students an opportunity to share and make connections to their theoretical and their practical experiences throughout our program. So the Capstone is a professional course where we have a lot of professional discussions with the students. And so we've made an effort to include the diversity, equity, and inclusion in the teaching and profession. And how is that included? So we provide them an opportunity, and they have a project where they have to identify an important relevant topic in education. They have to research pertinent information, pertinent material. They have to choose professional resources for the class, and they then have to lead an engaging session on the topic for all the students in the course. Again, when Carrie and I began to transition this and bring this more into our course, we were a little nervous, but it was a joy to see them using the language, and it was almost second nature for them. So it was great to see that. We discussed the definitions of DEI with the students. We develop evolving resources for them, so we provide an opportunity for them to share what they know. And we do a lot of reflection with them. And this is where I really feel that our role as professors is important, because you have to support them with their challenges of researching inside themselves and challenging their own bias. So that is a really neat and a more awareness that I've had, is how do I support the students as they struggle with challenging themselves.
And this course that John and I share, it was really interesting to see the kinds of topics that students chose, and wanting to always have that reflective notion of what are your own strengths and what are your own challenges. And once you have a challenge, having to make a plan for how you're going to address this. And as this is a course where students take at the very end of their program, the next piece is that bridge to the profession. So that plan for how to address is not just, okay, this is what I'm going to do next semester, or this is what I will plan the first week of classes. It's that lifelong thinking, that lifelong reflection, and making a plan to have that be systemic in all of our lives. And as our students see themselves as professionals. What we have found is interesting is that we've listed here some of the self-chosen topics by students. And where I give credit for sure is the process where this is throughout our entire program. Now, to be clear, it's not a set scope and sequence yet. And we're deciding whether or not we want to go that way. But what is there are pockets where it continues. So I'm thinking about a student who in one of John's courses where I was in to do some co-teaching, a student revealed some challenges that she was having where she didn't see that the LGBTQ community was something that she should address. And that was, it's kind of shocking to hear that, but also we have to take everyone where they're at and understand, again, our own biases, right? And by the time this student got to Capstone, I had the pleasure of working with her in that course. And when this was first happening, they were identifying the topic. She said, I need to do something. I did not know what was coming, to be clear. And she said, I don't know enough about LGBTQ. She said, and I don't know enough about what my role should be. So she took on that topic, and she asked a student who's very passionate and has studied how to teach young children about the LGBT community, and they partnered together. I want to be so clear that I did not have that happen. The students had that happen. And from that, some really great risk-taking discussions were able to happen by students saying, I don't know about this, I feel uncomfortable. Others could say, well, I'm okay over here, but I really don't know about, I'm a little bit worried about people with significant disabilities and how will I incorporate that, even though we're the inclusion school, right? So really having that self-awareness to be able to say, I'm learning, I know I need to, so what am I going to do about it? And then as you can see, these are some of the other topics. And we kept this last one, the self-care management for teachers, on here, particularly because of the year and a half that we have all just lived together and the lives of teachers, but it's definitely connected to DEI. When that group did their presentations, the readings and viewings, it was definitely an intersectionality aspect to it. So when I think about this, I'm incredibly excited about the changes and simultaneously know how much we have to do going forward, but at least we're on the road.
So one of the areas that we really wanted to focus on was the experience that our students are having during student teaching. and I oversee the reflective seminars. So this process that we've been going through was reflecting not only on the readings and the discussions and the presentations, but also personally, we're all doing separate readings and working with restorative justice processes and reflecting on our own biases and our own privilege. And that made me reflect on the way that I'm communicating with our student teachers. And I had to reconsider the language that we're using to describe this relationship that our students have with a school-based teacher educator. I always used the language of, we are guests in this person's classroom, and we need to be respectful of the fact that we are in their space. But what I didn't realize was that that kind of language was potentially disempowering students. And in particular, our students of color were feeling that if they overheard someone saying something along the lines of perhaps making fun of somebody's accent or saying something derogatory about a holiday like Kwanzaa or something, our students didn't feel empowered that they could speak. And what I realized is I need to change this narrative. Instead of saying, we are guests and leaving it at that, we need to think of the fact that if I'm a guest in someone's home and I'm allergic to shellfish, I need to tell my host that this is a problem. And so it's a manner of how we can have those conversations. And those are difficult conversations to have. So we wanted to prepare our students to be able to specifically dive into some different types of difficult scenarios. And fortunately, we have a colleague in our art education program who put together some very useful slides, which are loading right now, of different types of scenarios where our students would be able to specifically think about their language use and ways that they can interact. In this particular example, a phrase that we often use, good morning, boys and girls. We didn't realize that that statement in itself is not truly inclusive, especially given the way students identify their gender identity, that is not reflected for everyone when we say a simple statement like good morning, boys and girls. So it's helping to bring these things to a higher level awareness, as Carrie mentioned, but also helping our students to think about how are they going to respond in these kinds of situations. And likewise, not just their language use, but when are they not speaking? If a student is saying something that is racist or homophobic or sexist, are our students responding or just letting it slide? And by letting things slide, it's actually condoning that type of a behavior. So we wanted to give our students an opportunity to really practice what we're preaching and put it into scenarios before they're out in their student teaching. So this was something that we would do during our first weeks or in orientation. Likewise, we also wanted to think about how our students are performing in the student teaching. Because when we did a careful analysis of how our students were performing, there was a disproportionate number of BIPOC students who were in the students that were performing less well. And we really needed to think about, is it the students that are performing less well, or is it something about our expectations that is not appropriate? And so we had a group of us work very carefully on our rubric. And right there was the clean version, but I want to show you the messy version. Our categories, the prompts, our constructs, are very much typical that most of us would do in the field of education. But we wanted to go through and look at this with a more inclusive lens, and in particular with the lens of DEI. And you can see the black represents language that was pulled over from the prior version. The red is what we struck out, and the blue is what we added, what was new. And in the beginning, some of these constructs really didn't need a whole lot of tweaking. Maybe we wanted to make sure that we used some more gender neutral language. But as we continue through, you can see that there were lots of changes made. So for example, under assessment, we wanted to ensure that our students were not only able to use a variety of assessments and analyze the results to decide on future teaching, but also to think about the potential for bias that can exist in the different ways that students are being assessed, and how can that bias be addressed. We wanted to look at more of facilitating positive behaviors as opposed to behavior management, which was our view in our earlier iteration of this rubric. We wanted to ensure that students are not just monitoring behaviors, but that in fact, that they are creating positive learning environments, that they are not just the person who is overseeing, but that they are a true facilitator of a safe and welcoming environment. And so you can see that this applies for all students, but we also truly wanted to hone in on aspects of DEI. And we used to have something that was called Candidate Demonstrates Cultural Competency. But you can see that we kept some of this Black language, the Black font, but we added a lot of this blue because we realized we needed to be much clearer in what our expectations were for what does this mean, and that we needed to add some additional categories, and we needed to also have the students reflecting on their own situations, recognizing that some situations can privilege and some situations can marginalize in the particular lifetime that we're living in. The area that was perhaps the most controversial or the most interesting to have a conversation about are the ones that are highlighted here in yellow, which have to do with language use. We realized that we were looking at language use from the perspective of a standard, and that any linguist will tell you that standard is something that is constantly evolving over time, and that we needed to be thinking, instead of what are written language conventions, are our students being effective in what they need to be doing? So is written communication appropriate for the intended audience and purpose? That's more important than anything else when a person is communicating. When a person is speaking, are they clear and understandable? Are they providing enough detail? Those were the things that we realized we needed to be focusing on, and a whole lot less on whether or not it's error-free or using conventions. So you can see that in terms of changes, it's changes in practice, in the way we're using language, and also in policy and how we are assessing our students. And the professional behaviors assessment that I referred to with the scenarios, that is another assessment that now we want to go back and look at again, because as was mentioned before, we recognize that we have a lot of work to do and we just have our toes on the line, as Carrie said. So I'm going to turn it over to Cubby, who's going to tell you a little bit more about some of his experiences.
Sorry.
Many of our students came to us already with commitments to anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice, but not all did. And through the work we've been doing, we've been able, as you've seen through what everybody's been talking about, we've been able to be guides for all of these students, wherever they're coming from, as they work together to unlearn their biases and to use their power and their privilege for their students. And they've become advocates for their students. So a story that I really love is about a student teacher I had who heard some teachers complaining about a non-binary student because they didn't know how to use that student's pronouns. So the student teacher went in the next day and brought her compassion with her compassion for the student and for the teachers. And she said, I can help you. And she shared her knowledge, her understanding, her compassion, and even a tip sheet. And she wasn't a neutral bystander because she knew she couldn't be. She shared these gifts instead, making a positive impact for that student and those teachers and students to come. And that was the kind of guest she was. And so back to you.
And that's just one example. We have so many others of our students who have become advocates in this work. And that's something that I hope that we can really continue for them and for us as a school of education. So I know we've stressed this a lot in this presentation, but this work is never done. And we are left with lots of questions, a couple next steps, and mostly a lot of struggles that we have experienced and that we know we're going to continue to experience. And we mean that in a good way, struggle in a good way. So we'll continue to do the work. We're going to continue having ongoing professional development, both in the School of Education and in our programs specifically. And a question that we continue to have is, how do we make sure that we're calling everyone in without calling people out? We want to make sure that everyone is invited in this work, and it's important work that we value. And we think a lot about how to make sure that everyone is involved in this work. This work is hard, this work is messy, but it's also valuable, and it's something that we deeply believe in. And it's part of who we are at Nazareth and our School of Education. So we hope that today you've learned a little bit about our process. And if there's any questions or any way that we can help you think about your process and what you're going through in your education programs, you are welcome to reach out to any of us, and we'd be happy to talk about our experience. Thank you, everyone.